And we have some special guests with us tonight, and I would like to start out by introducing them. We have David and John Schrader, and Jackie Johnson and Margaret Miller, or Margot Miller. So, and of course, they're Asher Schrader's sons. So, it's very nice to have you with us tonight.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
And next up is David Kendell giving a talk about the Kelsey sword and about Mr. Kelsey. So, without further ado, Civil War.
Thank you very much, Jack. I don't think I need the microphone, do I? Can you hear me without it?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll speak loudly and clearly. Well, Jack's a hard act to follow. I've been following him for 30 years, and we've always had a good time together. He's provided a lot of leadership, and I've learned a lot working with him over the years. And he's truly one of the greatest leaders Jackson County has ever had. And he's done a lot of good for the people, and it's wonderful. It's been wonderful to work for him. So he's been a really good leader, not only at the Historical Society, but county-wide. Well, as Jack said, I'm David Kendell. I live over in Bellevue Township. I've been interested in Civil War history all my life. The first book that I ever remember buying was a book by Bruce Catton called This Hallowed Ground. And I still have it, and I looked at it the other day to make sure that I still had it. And I started collecting cannons and Civil War memorabilia and weapons when I was 6 or 7 years old. And at that time, Springfield rifles from the Civil War were about $60 or $70. All this stuff was very cheap at that time, and I started collecting it and have a whole collection of little cannons. And then my father helped me build a replica cannon of a 12-pounder Napoleon that we used to pull in parades, and we used that for years as our kind of Civil War prop. And we even used that in the Heritage Days probably 40 or 50 years ago in Bellevue. When I was growing up, I grew up around Chicago, in the suburbs of Chicago, and my father was very interested in the Civil War, but my mother was interested in the Revolutionary War. So when we would go on a vacation, if my mother was in charge, we were going to a Revolutionary War battlefield or cemetery. If my father was in charge, we'd be going to a Civil War. And very seldom did we get to go to both, although in Virginia we did a lot of both. So that was very interesting. So my interest in the Civil War goes back a long way. So tonight we're going to be talking about Civil War history in Jackson County, and specifically about a sword that's been well-traveled and is finally returned to a good place of display in the Jackson County Historical Society Museum. The sword is an 1861 ceremonial sword that was presented to Lieutenant Florilla Kelsey, and I can't find any information about his first name. All I can find is that it's a Spanish derivative of Florian, so that was his name. So from now on, I'm going to refer to him as Lieutenant Kelsey or Captain Kelsey. He was promoted at one time. So the sword now has been returned to Jackson County, is on permanent display in this museum. Before you leave tonight, go back and look at the excellent new display where the sword is displayed. It's in a beautiful case back there, along with other Civil War memorabilia. The return of the sword was made possible by monies from the Asher Schrader Memorial Fund. The sword's return and new display was facilitated by the hard work of many Jackson County Historical Society volunteers. Richard and Helen Rockroller, Jim Curran, Terry Rubel, Nancy Tush, Jim Palmer, Kevin Brown, Dave Consweiler, Marcella Hinke, and Pat and Phil Gent. So we've got a new display, so make sure and see that tonight before you leave. And then with Fair Week coming up, make sure and encourage other people to come and look at it. Bring your family, bring your friends, bring your neighbors, bring your children or your grandkids. I think that's the only way that young people get into this museum, is when someone who's a little bit older like myself brings them and takes them by the hand and shows them around from place to place. I remember that happening to me in the 70s when my Uncle Charles Bevan was one of the first original members on the board here at the Jackson County Historical Museum. He was my uncle, but he's also an uncle to Kevin Brown and Karen Brown, so that makes Kevin a legacy board member, I guess. So, unfortunately, our Uncle Charles died in 1971, so he wasn't on the board very long, but he was very interested in the history of Jackson County and the Jackson County Historical Society. As I went through life then, my mother, Alda Kendell, was on the board for a long time. So I would come over here and visit displays with her, and she would always tell me when there were new exhibits and fascinating things going on. As a young child, I was fascinated by the Civil War artillery shells that they had in the back corner. There were probably 70 or 100 of them, and I would look at them and try to figure out what they were and where they came from. And I always thought, I wonder if some of these are still alive, but obviously they aren't. We're here today and they never went off. I noticed that there's 5 or 10 of them in the new display back there, but I wonder where all the rest of them are. So that was a fascinating thing. So we need to encourage young people to come into the Jackson County Historical Society Museum and explain to them the important history of Jackson County. So back to the sword for a minute. The sword is a ceremonial sword, and it was presented to Lieutenant Kelsey by the people of Makokado upon the formation of Company A in the late summer of 1861. There was a Captain Drips that was also presented a sword at the same time, and his sword is also on display at other museums. And so Captain Drips and Lieutenant Kelsey were elected by the 101 members of Company A of Jackson County before they were mustered in Dubuque later that summer. As the custom was at that time, the officers of a company were elected by lot, so the most popular people and probably the most capable people were elected, and then they represented and became the officers as they went through. So from the information I can find out, there was Captain Drips and there were about 4 lieutenants at the time the group was mustered in. So Company A was part of the 9th Iowa Infantry. It was about 101 men strong, and they were mustered in Dubuque in September 1861. A lot of other companies went up to Dubuque, organized at a place called Union Park in Dubuque, and then they were sent south by steamboat. Company A went south by steamboat in September of 1861 for duty near St. Louis. So essentially, for a long time, from September 1861 till the Battle of Pea Ridge in March of 1862, they were kind of in garrison duty, guarding railroad tracks, guarding things, and not really involved in active combat. So as you read the comments from the company at that time, things were a little bit boring. They were looking for action. They were complaining about the food not being very good, their tents leaking and having inadequate shoes and things like that, but they were issued their weapons and they were working their weapons at that time. Then they were engaged in heavy fighting at the March 7th and 8th Battle of Pea Ridge on the Missouri-Arkansas border. And Pea Ridge is actually in Arkansas, but it's near the Missouri-Arkansas border. And when you look at a map and find out where Pea Ridge is, it's also called Elkhorn Tavern by the Confederates, but it's real close to Bentonville, Arkansas, which is the headquarters of Walmart. So I suppose if you go to visit the headquarters of Walmart and their fancy new art museum, you should take a detour over and visit Pea Ridge and get some Civil War history going while you're there. At the time of the battle lasted 2 days, and one of the most important things about the battle is it was constantly snowing and there was slush and it was cold and raining. So all during the battle things were pretty miserable, not only the battle but the weather conditions as they were. Captain Drips was killed in the fight and Kelsey took over command as Drips fell. Kelsey was also wounded and then passed the command on to a Lieutenant Riley, who commanded the company for the remainder of the battle. Riley was cited for leadership and bravery along with Drips and Kelsey in the dispatches of Lieutenant Colonel Herron, who was in command of the 9th Iowa at that time. So obviously Drips and Kelsey and Riley were very good leaders and had the backing and support of their men and were successful in the battle. The battle went back and forth on the 7th, but by the time the 8th term came around, the Confederates had pretty much had enough, and it turned out to be a pretty significant Union victory. It essentially saved the state of Missouri from going into the Confederacy and held the state of Missouri for the Union. At that time also a lot of troops were dispersed throughout Missouri to make sure that there weren't other insurrections that caused it to become a slave state and go back into the Confederacy. And at that time the major factor was that the Confederates needed to move back to Arkansas and that Missouri was going to stay a free state instead of become a slave state and become part of the Confederacy. Kelsey went on to serve in company of the 9th Iowa. Before the Vicksburg campaign, he was promoted to captain, and he was killed in the siege of Vicksburg. He was wounded on May 22nd, 1863. He had his leg amputated the next day, and then he died on May 26th of 1863. And he's buried at the Vicksburg National Cemetery. As I said earlier, the swords were presented to Grips and Kelly in September of 1861. After their death, the ceremonial swords were returned to their families. Kelsey's son gave the sword to the Maquoketa chapter of the GAR. And for those of you who don't know, GAR was the Grand Army of the Republic, and it was a veterans organization that was very prominent probably up through the 1930s. It kind of disappeared as the last of the Civil War veterans disappeared and died, and I don't really think it was ever combined into the Legion. It was a standalone organization, but it was called the Grand Army of the Republic, and they had various reunions at various battlefields throughout the United States. One of the most famous ones is the one that they had on the 50th anniversary of Gettysburg, and they were interested in keeping Civil War history alive. So Kelsey's son gave the sword to the GAR chapter. This occurred on the 25th anniversary of the Battle of Pea Ridge in 1887. From there, it went to the Ellis Museum. And the Ellis Museum was a museum in Maquoketa, and it was called the Ellisonian, as a takeoff on the Smithsonian. And you find that referred to back and forth from time to time. It certainly was gone by the time I was alive, but it had a lot of Indian artifacts, and it had a lot of Civil War artifacts and other things like that. It was essentially liquidated in the 1860s. At that time, the sword that had belonged to Kelsey disappeared into the collector's market. And the sword was out there somewhere. Nobody knows exactly where it was. Recently, the sword emerged at a show in Las Vegas where a collector made a Maquoketa connection because of the Ellis Museum and some other rifles that had been used at the Battle of Wounded Knee. And the collector realized that it was from Maquoketa and that it was important, and then made contact here with the museum, and from there it was arranged that it was to be purchased. And the purchase was to be facilitated then by the money from Asher Schrader's memorial with the consent of his family. So that's how it ended up back in the new display, and it's back there in the back corner. I just looked at it again. It's a beautiful display and a beautiful collection, and it's nice to have a piece of Civil War history back in Maquoketa where it belongs, and I doubt it will ever leave, and it's in a good, secure place. They wouldn't let me bring it up here tonight, so it's behind glass, so it's in a good spot. So make sure and look at that before you leave tonight. Let's talk a little bit more about Vicksburg and the Civil War. Vicksburg was very important where Captain Kelsey died. Vicksburg essentially blockaded the Mississippi River. The Confederates took over in early 1861, and trade up and down the Mississippi River ceased. It was a huge economic impact to Jackson County. My family, for example, had 3 boats south of Vicksburg when the Confederates blockaded, and they burned them on sandbars and walked home. They didn't want the Confederates to gain access to their boats or the cargo, so they destroyed them and they walked home. Vicksburg sits on the Mississippi River where the Yazoo River comes in from the east. And my family also had a lot of interest in the Yazoo River and a lot of shipping interest at that time. So all of a sudden, my relatives who owned Potter's Mill at that time could no longer ship to New Orleans and then ship to England and France, and it just about broke them. It was a terrible economic crisis for them. The kind of wheat that they produced, the Union Army didn't want, and they couldn't get hardware or books or linens or anything else from New Orleans, from New York down to New Orleans, or from England or France. So it was a huge economic impact on Jackson County. You have to remember, at that time we didn't have railroads in Jackson County. The railroads really didn't get into Jackson County until the 1870s. So all of a sudden we couldn't ship things south and earn money, and they couldn't ship things north. So it was economically devastating for the people in Bellevue, for my family and the other people that were shipping up and down the river, and it was a great hardship for 2 years. Another tie-in for Jackson County is that Ulysses S. Grant was in charge of the Union forces that led the siege of Vicksburg. Vicksburg surrendered on July 4th, 1863. It was greatly overshadowed by the Battle of Gettysburg, which was going on at the same time. But a lot of people feel strategically that the siege of Vicksburg and the opening of the Mississippi River was much more important than the Battle of Gettysburg. It did a lot of things. It secured the Mississippi River for the Union Army. It was the prime means of transportation up and down the river. They could move things, they could do a lot of things and move troops. And it was very important. It also tied in a lot with the railroads that ran east from the river. So it was a very important thing. It was a bloody siege. A lot of people got killed, including Captain Kelsey at that time, but it was very important. And it really elevated U.S. Grant to the point that he was a contender for being the Chief General of the Army, and then promoted from there and sent east to get rid of the Confederates back there. So it was a big important thing. A local tie-in with General Grant, we have the Lukey display on the other side of the Civil War display, and when Grant was selling leather and working in his father's leather store in Galena, he used to travel by packet boat to Bellevue and sell leather to Lukey Brothers. And then he used to also stay at the Central House Hotel, which is where the Riverview is in Bellevue at that time. So there's another kind of tie-in to the Civil War for us in Jackson County and in Bellevue. So I think, as I said before, the Civil War history is overlooked in general. I don't think that they do enough the Civil War history in school today. When I was in school in senior year in high school, it was about half the year, and the other half was the Revolutionary War. So it was very important at that time. We were all encouraged and had to memorize the Gettysburg Address. And if you look at historical documents, the Gettysburg Address is the closest thing we have to Scripture in the United States that talks about what the United States is about and how important everything is. It's a 3 or 4 minute speech. It's very important, and I think every child in school should be encouraged to memorize it and understand it. It's a very important piece that is largely overlooked. Let me move on a little bit. We've talked about the sword, we've talked about the Civil War, we've talked about some tie-ins to Jackson County. Let's talk about Asher Schrader for a minute. Asher was a good friend of mine. He was a 33-year strawberry customer. We've been in business for 35 years. We started in 1987. That's about the same time he and Catherine moved back here. And he showed up one time at the strawberry business, wanted a box of strawberries to make jam. And he pretty much got his box of strawberries every year from there on for 33 years, whether I brought them over to him or whether he came to the farmer's market. And we always had a good time talking, and it was just always a good time to run into him and meet and exchange stories. The first time I ever met Asher, I was in college at Iowa State, and he was the chief legal counsel at the DOT, which was a very important position. And my mother called me one day and said that I should go meet this man, that he was a family friend and that he was a nice guy, and so on and so forth. So I got the courage and I called him, and I went to meet him one day at his office. And he had a very important looking office, and he was very nicely dressed in a suit. He was sitting at his desk, got up, and he was so tall I was scared. Because I'm only 5'8", and I think Asher must have been 6'3" or 6'4". He was a 6'5", 6'6". He was a big man, so he got me up from behind the desk. He stood up, and it scared me to death. But he had a beautiful smile and a very gracious manner and a nice handshake, and we got along just fine. We talked a lot about our families in Maquoketa, and he was a friend of my uncle's, and my mother was one of his sister's best friends, and our grandmothers were good friends, and so on and so forth. And so then I went over to their house one time and met Catherine, and it was nice to have another non-Iowa State friend at Iowa State. It's always nice when you're in college to know somebody that isn't involved with the university to provide a little different lookout. And then as we talked, I found out that he was a friend of my Uncle Charles, who was probably 4 years older than he was, and that his father Leroy and my father Godfrey Bevan were on the city council together in Maquoketa. Leroy was the mayor and my father was a city council member, and that they also died a few months apart. Leroy died, I think, in May of 1945, while Asher was still being processed out as a prisoner of war, and then my grandfather Godfrey died in July. So my Uncle Charles and Asher were good friends. They played basketball together, Asher for the high school and my Uncle Charles for the community college in Macoka at that time. And then when their fathers died, they became even closer friends. They were both military men, and they sat and spent a lot of time talking and exchanging stories and things like that. So they got to know each other that way. One other thing that was kind of funny, it was the first time I ever met Asher at his office at the DOT. We talked about a guy named Paul Allers. And Paul Allers was an attorney in Jackson County who later went on to form a huge law firm in Des Moines. And Asher said to me that when he was young, that Paul was in business with his father, I believe, and that Asher said that Paul Allers was the nearest thing to Abe Lincoln in Jackson County. Not because of his wisdom, but because of his courthouse and courtroom antics. That Paul was always trying funny things and telling jokes and doing strange things. So that's a whole other story for another day that we can explore, all the Paul Allers stories. But Paul and Asher were acquaintances, and so that's another common thing that we had to talk about. As we went through the years, and I got back here in 1985, I would come over here to the Historical Society and drop my mother off, and my mother Alda and Asher were good friends, and they were also friends with Wanda Cornelius. So it's hard for me to stand up here tonight and not think that my mom, Wanda, and Asher are going to walk in the back door at any minute and give me a hard time for what I'm doing. So it's a little bit sad for me to think about that, but they had a lot of fun together. My mother wouldn't come home. The meeting would be over at 9 o'clock, and she wouldn't get home till 10 or 11, and I'd ask her where she'd be. She said, oh, well, Asher and Wanda and I were sitting there talking. We lost track of the time. There'd be a snowstorm, and my mother would be fighting her way to the... not thinking anything about it, that they were just sitting there talking and having a good time. So I enjoyed my acquaintance with Asher, and I learned a lot about my family through him, and I learned a lot about other things, and always enjoyed having a visit and talking with him. In his last few years, I would deliver the strawberries to his house, and we'd sit in the family room and talk for a couple of the hours in the afternoon. It was nice for me. I got out of the sun and the heat, and I turned my cell phone off, and nobody knew where I was. So they couldn't catch up with me, so it was a great hiding place, and we had a lot of fun. In conclusion, go back and visit the sword display. It's wonderful to have it back in Jackson County. The whole Civil War display is magnificent. There's a lot of artifacts there to explain. It's great to see it. It's fun to be here again. And I just think it's great that this was a good use of the memorial money for Asher Schrader to get that sword back to near where it needs to be and where it will be permanently preserved. And again, as I said, we need to encourage our children, grandchildren, and neighbors to come here and enjoy this museum. It has a lot to offer. It's a great air-conditioned space during the fair time. Get the kids in here and take them around and show them all the neat things that we have. So, and again, thank you to Jack and to Bonnie for inviting me to come here and speak tonight. And thank you for your interest in Jackson County history. Thank you, Jack.
Well, at this time, I would like to have John and David come up. We have this plaque that will be placed by the sword, and it says Kelsey Civil War Sword, acquisition made possible by the Asher Schrader Memorial Fund. And Rich, if you go back with them and see that it gets placed where you need to have it placed, okay. So that would be great. Okay. And thank you so much for being here.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Though since you haven't, most of you haven't seen it, it is just beautiful. And Bonnie was at a board meeting. Bonnie said, I got a call from some guy that collects Civil War memorabilia, and he said he wanted to know about a sword. He said, there's a sword that I saw at this show, and it actually has Maquoketa, Iowa on the handle. So it must be something important. So of course the board was really excited about that. And so we said, you know, check some more on that. And so he offered to purchase it and let us purchase it from him at the same price that he paid for it. And so we cannot buy for our museum. So luckily, Asher had memorial funds left, and we were able to use those funds to purchase the sword. And so it'll have a permanent home where it belongs in Jackson County. So it really is, it's amazing. When I saw it this past weekend, when I was volunteering here, I was just amazed. And the red background really sets it off. It's just absolutely gorgeous. Okay, now we'll go to the annual meeting. I'd like the board members that are here to stand up. We have Sarah Jones in the back, Bill Schwenker in the back, John Hoff, Deb Holm, Kevin Brown, Dick Kunow, Nancy Cornelius, Johnson. You'll always be Cornelius, Cindy, I'm sorry.
That's fine.
Yeah. And of course, we couldn't do any of this, and I'm sorry, Mary Ann Cregan is also on the board, and she's also videoing on this so that it will be able to be shown on our station.
Sarah Jones?
Pardon? Did I say Sarah?
Yeah. Did you say Deb?
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought I said Sarah first, because I was looking right at her. Anyway, we couldn't do any of this stuff that we're doing if we didn't have Bonnie. So stand up, Bonnie. We also couldn't do a lot of this stuff without the volunteers that help us tremendously. I believe somebody and I were talking before and said something about the age of the volunteers is going up and up and up. And how do you get younger people involved? That's something we're going to have to work on, because I was thrilled. I have the month of July, and I always give Bonnie a hard time because I said, it's always got 5 weekends in July. And sometimes it's pretty hard to get the volunteers because everybody's lives are busy. But this year, I had the best luck I've ever had. I did it in 2 days. So anyway, those of you that volunteer, thank you so much for your time and your talents. So with that, we'll move on to calling the meeting to order. And I think Bonnie said you passed out or gave them minutes of the last year's meeting.
I was hoping they picked them up on the way by,
Oh, okay.
but we'll pass them. Sorry.
If you didn't get them, we'll get you one. And while she's doing that, Kevin, do you want to give us an overview of the financials?
Is there a handout for treasurer?
It's coming.
Okay. Kevin Brown, who's always keeping us on our toes and letting us know what we do and don't have.
Well, what we had this year was pretty much the right amount of money. Right halfway and almost surprisingly, we raised almost the same amount that we spent. And it does take a lot of money to run the place. And of course it takes, I remember when I first came, it was about 80,000. And it takes quite a bit more than that nowadays, because we do have, a lot of projects beyond just normal operations. But, just like your home, and our electricity bills have gone up a lot, and our heating bills have gone up a lot. So we appreciate greatly those that contribute on a regular basis, or even leave memorials or anything like that. That's all very helpful. If you have a handout yet, I don't know, but I kind of just threw in the big numbers, because I don't think anybody's particularly interested in finding out what our monthly electric But, for the entire fiscal year, which of course is July 1 to June 30, we brought in $121,589. And quite a bit of that isn't small money, what I mean is memorial funds and stuff. Jackson County is, I'm sure Jack and Mr. Mellon are getting us the money that we get from them every year. But they have always been very good about putting money into our organization. Birdie for Charity, probably most of you are aware that I just wrapping up down to Quad Cities. We've always done pretty well with that. That particular situation requires that you have some money on hand, the equivalent of what you received all year for donations. You can send it down to them. About 3 or 4 months later, the money comes back with half 8%, 10% more than you sent them. And wonderful, I forget what, I just seen in the paper, they distributed a huge amount of money to all the various organizations again. So 121,000, almost 600 we raised. We spend 121,956. Only $367 difference. Considering the amount of money we went through and all the projects we have on the go all the time, I thought that was remarkably good. And as everybody stood up at this podium and mentioned, we need more members. So, those of you that are, you get your grandkids for a weekend or something, or they come from far away to visit, grab them by the hand and bring them down here and walk them through the place. It would be great. As Jack mentioned, our average age is kind of climbing, although there's quite a few young people out here tonight. But anyway, that's all I really have today. We had a decent year, a lot going on, always is. And of course we have our future challenges, but we've already worked through them. I just mentioned in here, you will see a trench being dug all the way around the Clinton Engine Building. It is not being done for any pollution issues. That's kind of on the city's head for the most part. But we have had a long time problem with some water seeping into the basement sometimes after storm events. So we're putting in a drain field that goes all the way around it. Hopefully that will help with the problem. And it's always been a little bit damp in the basement over there, and we're hoping if we get rid of the water, get rid of some of the damp. So we need 15,000 of that right away, so we just started not spending money. So, any other questions? Any questions? Okay, I'll hand it back to Jack.
Thanks, Kevin. When I first got on this board, Wanda Cornelius talked me into it, and I guess I've been on it ever since. And when I first got on, Wanda told me, and all of my fellow board members will also say, it is a working board. Bonnie does a very good job of keeping us busy. But of course, we need to have our fundraisers. And we're getting ready for our Pioneer Day that will be September 10th. And Mary, can you come up for a minute since you're recording? Not this year, but we're already working on next year. And our talk tonight about the Civil War, I'm going to have Mary give you a little scenario of what's going to happen next year.
Next year? Yep. All right, I wasn't really prepared for this. You kind of put me on the spot, but we'll take a shot at it. Next year, we're looking forward to something very different. This Historical Society has wanted to do this for quite a few years, and I think we're able to put this together. We're going to have a Union and Confederate, like a war zone, so to speak.
A reenactment?
Reenactment.
Oh, great. Yeah.
And with cannons, the whole 9 yards. We're working on that. So, I mean, we're like 99% sure this is going to go down. So we would really appreciate a lot of word of mouth and to get people in here. We really want to do something exciting and new and I'm hoping that everything comes through as planned, so.
She has really been working hard with those. We've talked about doing something like this several different times, but you have to start so early so that you can get them booked to come and reenact the war. So
When is it going to be?
it'll be in September again of '24. But we have lots of things planned for this September, and we're still working on that and putting it all together. But we're going to have a lot more entertainment. We're also going to be starting with a breakfast, which we haven't had before. We're going to have breakfast from 8 to 10:30, and then there will be a church service, a short church service at 11. And all of the other activities will start at 11 and go till 5. And several different groups that are going to be doing skits and lots of fun things for the kids. We're going to have 2 bouncy houses, one for the little kids and one for the little older kids, so that they're not in there at the same time beating up on each other. So that was a little bit of a problem last year, so we're excited about that. But keep that on your agenda for the 10th of September. And also, all of you wonderful bakers, you canners, you jam makers, the general store will be there, so bring your donations so we can sell them, and that'll give us some more money for Kevin to put in the bank. Well, we do a pretty good job at doing that. Anyway. Committee reports, building and grounds, Dick Kunow.
An update on the progress of the windows at Clinton Indian Building. It seems like that's been going on forever, but I talked to Bruce Timmerman with Zephyr Glass, see if we could, there's a few projects that need to be completed before we can be done. The good news is they haven't built it yet, which is pretty amazing. There's a few windows there that have ductwork going in and out. He's working on plans for those, how to incorporate some storm windows on that. There's a continuing moisture problem on some windows, which that's how the whole program started. We had moisture between the inside storm windows and the exterior glass. The whole project would have been much easier if we could have just ripped out the old windows in the Clinton Indian Building, but that was not possible because they were architecturally significant to getting us on the historical register. So that's compounded the problem a lot, having to maintain those windows. But at any rate, the new storm windows are on the exterior. I think most people agree they look nice. We do have a moisture problem on some of the windows. Bruce has an idea about drilling holes in the frames to ventilate that, to maybe get rid of some of that moisture. To that end, Bonnie is going to keep track of which are the worst offenders in the windows. As Bruce, again from Zephyr Glass, indicated, we also have to pressurize that building to take care of the TCE problem, and he was afraid if we drilled too many vent holes, we would not be able to pressurize the building. So we're chasing our tail once again with these flagging windows. So I think if we just continue working away at it as we have for how many years now, Ron? More than ever. And finally he'll be able to send us a bill. And to his credit, he hasn't been hounding us at all about the money. So persistence, I guess, is we hope that will win out in the end. I would also be remiss at a group like this if we didn't thank those who participated in making donations to the storm windows there, and of course to Deb Holm for her fantastic. So, thanks all around for that. And I was given an assignment by Bonnie to make you all junior G-men. As you probably have read, the railroad sign by the depot has been stolen. So, in the newsletter, they put out, bring it back, no questions asked. So we hope that's fruitful, but if people could just keep their eyes and ears open, maybe they'd hear something, the old story, if two people know a secret, it's not a secret, so maybe, So at any rate, hopefully we can get that back, the Bevins family, were the contributors to that, so. And then I added a lot to the railroad exhibit. So.
Thanks, David. And I'm going to tell you an anecdote that I learned this week at our Pioneer Day meeting. We've been having problems and difficulties with flies in our depot and in the rail car. And Bill Schwanker found out what you can do to get rid of those, or to eliminate it. Cinnamon sticks. Flies do not like cinnamon sticks. So they put some out in the railroad car and in the museum, and then they had to go sweep up the dead flies. So if you're having a gathering and you get flies, just stick out some cinnamon sticks. Bill McClintock couldn't be with us tonight, and so he was supposed to talk about the railroad. So does anybody else want to say anything about that? Other than cinnamon sticks to get rid of the flies. And the other item is the Hall of Fame. Bill McClintock and myself are on that committee. And in the past, we've always kept it a secret who was going to be honored in the Hall of Fame. But we've since decided that we need to publicize it. And so this year's recipient or inductee will be Marie Elsner. And she was a chiropractor. She taught it at Palmer. And she was a Makokanen and lived here most of her life, I believe. And I know she lived down the hill from us when I was a kid growing up. So that will be our inductee in the Hall of Fame, and that will be in November. Any of the participants here have any comments or questions that they'd like to ask the board? Okay. Next will be refreshments. And then our board will be having a board meeting following that. And, we're not being very nice to you because you have to go buy the Kelsey sword to get to the refreshments. We thought, a lot of time when we had our tribute to Jean Buckner, not too many people made the rounds of the different things that she's done for us. But we decided, or I didn't, somebody decided we're going to have it back in our creamery area. So you have to go right by the sword to see the goodies that are there. So thank you all for coming to spend your time visiting and enjoying, and there's lots of goodies back here. Thank you.